From DLA Piper, this is the Beyond the Curve podcast. In this episode, DLA Piper's Katie Hausfeld, Brian Benjet, and David Stier discuss the different types of company crises that can arise, how to prepare in advance, and ways to effectively and efficiently respond if needed.
Welcome, everyone, to our discussion on crisis management. Today, we'll discuss the different types of crises that can arise, how to prepare in advance, and how to effectively and efficiently respond if a crisis does occur. I'm Katie Hausfeld, co-chair of DLA Piper's Global Compliance Subgroup. I advise my clients in designing and implementing risk-based compliance programs, including developing and testing their crisis management plans. I also assist multinational companies in conducting internal investigations and responding to regulator inquiries and enforcement actions. I'm joined today by two of my colleagues, my fellow co-chair Brian Benjet and former Assistant U.S. Attorney Dave Stier. Brian?
Hi, this is Brian Benjet, and I've been a partner here at DLA Piper for about the last 12 years. And prior to joining the firm, I was in senior leadership roles at several multinational corporations in the legal department. Like Katie, I'm the co-chair of our global compliance program. I'm also one of the dispute folks on our healthcare steering committee in the healthcare sector. And my practice falls into, as Katie has said, assisting with the development and remediation and enhancement of compliance programs for corporate entities. And then I also work with certain companies on investigations, whether government or internal, or also on litigation matters. And I'll turn it over to Dave.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dave Stier. I joined DLA Piper as a partner in the White Collar and Global Investigations Group last January after spending around 12 years in the federal government. I spent 6 of those years at the Treasury Department and 6 as a federal prosecutor. At both places, I was investigating financial fraud and money laundering. I focus on Bank Secrecy Act and sanctions compliance and global investigations. Very happy to be here today.
Thank you both. Why don't we just jump right in? So planning for a crisis, as we all know, is a critical component of a company's business continuity planning. And a strong crisis management plan can ensure that a company is really prepared to deal with the unexpected and can continue their operations under difficult circumstances. So compliance and legal frequently drive organizations' efforts to develop these crisis plans. Brian, given your prior role in-house, and certainly as a compliance advisor who advises clients in developing these plans, what types of crises do you recommend that companies consider as they think through this?
Yeah, I think there's a broad set of crises that can arise, and they're obviously going to be somewhat sensitive to the operations and the business itself. But in a more general matter, you have to start to look at things like legal and regulatory crises. That can be dawn raids, it can be government subpoenas, it could be high-profile litigation, privacy and data security issues. Certainly, there's self-inflicted issues with data that comes out because of something an employee does, because of somehow something gets public. You have labor and employment issues. You could have union campaigns, retaliation issues, environmental health and safety, things coming from outside impacts such as cyber attacks, terrorism, natural disasters, the pandemic, which we obviously all went through, theft, supplier issues. And it can be a combination of a number of these things. At one of my prior organizations, we had what seemed like a simple routine litigation issue. Medical necessity, very common in the payer space, and you deny a claim for benefits or pre-authorization for a certain medical procedure. However, in this case, if you actually looked at the totality of the circumstances, you could see how it could metastasize into a crisis. Here we had a woman who was ultimately part of the Armenian community in LA, who was represented by Mark Garagos, a prominent Armenian lawyer in LA. Ultimately, when this became part of the John Edwards presidential campaign, with the presidential candidate in our hallway, in our lobby, protesting what we had done. So you have to not only look at the types of potential things, but also as something comes up, you have to look at, is this something that, although it looks routine, could also become something that's much greater? On the combination of the above side, you have personnel issues and labor issues, and you have also litigation issues. So these things don't come in neat packages, but you need to really think about, from your business perspective, what are the types of things that could branch out into a significant crisis? And it really should be a proactive, thoughtful process.
Those are all great points, Brian. And I think to your point, these don't come in neat packages. So every crisis is going to be different. And that being said, I think there are common themes that we see throughout our practice that we would advise that people consider when analyzing the probability of a crisis occurring, as well as the impact on the business. Dave, given your time at the DOJ, what do you think businesses should consider when thinking through the impact of a crisis?
It's a good question, Katie. And usually at this point in a presentation, I would give my formal DOJ disclaimer. Thankfully, I no longer have to do that. I will say, though, when I was a federal prosecutor, I think I would have assumed that companies have voluntarily reporting to the government and immediately cooperating really at the very top of their list. Since coming to private practice, I've come to really much more deeply appreciate the complexity involved in managing crises from just so many perspectives and managing the sometimes competing constituents and priorities. So the types of things I would consider, and Brian has already gone over some of these: business concerns, continuity of operations, systems failures, damage to share price, customer exposure, and related. There are also public relations concerns that can sometimes take real priority, and you need to be careful there with respect to protecting privilege. There are, of course, regulatory and government intervention concerns, and then there is the importance of trying to get the client to conduct a prompt but meaningful internal investigation. So, look, I think critical to engaging with the government is the importance of having a thoughtful plan in place, following it thoughtfully, having decision-making informed by really this ever-present reality that depending on the crisis, the government is really likely to find out sooner rather than later, and often that is sooner. I think in my experience so far, and certainly drawing on my experience at DOJ, the most important thing that one can do is to carry out the steps, carry out your plan with integrity, with an eye towards seeking to preserve evidence and preserve the attorney-client privilege, the work product protection, and knowing if and when you are government-facing, often with the federal government now, to get the benefit of what's called a voluntary self-disclosure under new DOJ and U.S. attorney policies. The disclosure typically needs to be made, quote, reasonably promptly after becoming aware of it. Now, there's really no specific deadline for DOJ, though depending on the nature of the crisis, there may be regulatory deadlines, such as the SEC's very, very prompt deadline for reporting cyber events. These deadlines may speed up decision-making and could force the company's hand if there's evidence or suspicion of intent based on the initial fact gathering, and it may warrant a sort of abundance of caution disclosure to regulators or to DOJ. Now, in my experience, these quote-unquote abundance of caution type disclosures can be very helpful. They would allow me and law enforcement to take action potentially behind the scenes to preserve an ongoing investigation or even open a new one. Clear communication, knowing one's roles, and really, frankly, ensuring the safety of the participants and the integrity of the investigation are the principles that drove us when I was in government and are good principles to carry forward in the private sector as well.
Thanks, Dave. And I think in addition to those principles, you're talking about the need to make decisions quickly, depending on the competing timelines and potentially regulatory deadlines that you have. So I think really understanding who are the decision makers is really critical to any comprehensive crisis management plan. So Brian, who do you typically recommend is included on the crisis management team, and how should the team be structured?
Yeah, so it's really important to have a core team, because being nimble and being able to quickly make reasoned decisions and quickly get communications out to the relevant constituents is crucially important. And if you either have no decision maker or too many decision makers, that process can really get clogged up. So you can't have that being too big. But it's going to depend a little bit on the crisis and the business as to who you have on your crisis management team. I think as we're talking about the legal and regulatory type of crises and things that may have legal ramifications, obviously a general counsel, someone in a legal role for application of attorney-client privilege is very important, as well as communications with government entities, with prosecutors, with outside counsel, things like that. Obviously, in a business that doesn't have an internal counsel, having a standing relationship with a go-to law firm for that, and you can use outside counsel in that piece, is truly key. But I think that you're going to want, obviously, some operational, some finance, and certainly the CEO who's going to carry weight in making decisions in these types of things. As you get into different types types of crises, like if it's a breach protocol or things of that nature, you're going to want to have IT. In some other crises, IT may not be crucial and you don't need them on the core team. They may to do certain tasks and can be instructed and consulted, but you're going to want to be there. As we're talking about this, though, I did want to just follow up on one thing from your last question on areas of impact and things that can go wrong. And it goes directly into who's on your core team and the need for flexibility. I mean, I was in-house at WorldCom when we had the slight accounting fraud, only about $11 billion. But one thing that happened was we had no financial leadership left because we fired everyone. So the only person left was the treasurer, who had been frozen out of all of the key financial decisions and planning. So when we literally every day said, how much money do we have? We actually didn't know. We didn't know some of the core financial people. So one of the things you actually have to think about from both a core team perspective and an impact perspective is leadership continuity. So as you think about these core teams, you've got to also put that in mind. When you develop your core crisis leadership team, there's probably 3 specific areas that you're really asking that group to do. The first one is make key decisions. They are the decision makers. They're steering the boat. They're taking in the information. They're taking in the advice from outside professionals. Certainly, you might have crisis PR people, lawyers. You might need scientific experts if it's an environmental, whatever it is. They're going to be integrating and making those key decisions, and they're going to be empowered to do that. The second thing that core leadership needs to do is establish priorities. There's going to be a fire hose. There's going to be so many things that can and should be done, but there's a key prioritization. And people in the organization are going to have their own priorities, but this core leadership team has to take this from the institutional perspective and say, this is what I need to do first to protect the organization and to move us forward. And then third, it's really controlling the communications. Communications are the lifeblood of getting through a crisis, but they're also the things that can exponentially increase a crisis. So you really need to have that good communications. I would say silence is deadly. If the leadership is silent, your salespeople are going to be out talking to customers saying whatever they think is going to help them with their customers, whether it's accurate or not. Obviously, accuracy is completely important. So when you think about your communications, you need to be quick, but you need to be accurate in that piece. And then obviously from a reporting perspective, you want to make sure that you have accurate reporting, and to the extent you're communicating with external regulators or the government. But at the same time, you have to have common sense. I mean, you can't just have lawyered up communications. So you also have to not only be lawyered up and thinking about it, lawyerly answers and risk, but what are common sense answers? So that control of communications is extremely important for the core team. You also then would obviously supplement that core team with whoever you need from, depending on maybe a piece of the business, because it's very specific to a piece of the business on that piece. And then if you think about it from a compliance officer perspective and a legal perspective, remediation, getting remediation strategy, you're going to want to bring in your compliance teams in order to make sure, because one piece of the puzzle in a crisis is to demonstrate quick and accurate and effective remediation. So you're going to want to have this broad, very significant team. And then finally, you're always going to want to have a succession plan, because the people you put on your team, your business changes, you reorganize the business, you buy something and there's a new business. So make sure that this is being updated and there's a succession plan. And obviously you want to make sure that this is standing and well known within the group, and that these people who are on the team know their roles and understand what their roles are.
So I think in addition to the people internally to the company who are on the team, who understand what their roles are and are looking at the impact on the business, there's also constituents outside of the company to consider. Dave, when you're working on developing a crisis management plan, what constituents do you recommend companies consider as part of their plan, and why?
It's a good question, Katie. We'll focus on employees first because they need to be a constituent with respect to their safety, protecting the attorney-client privilege, and preventing leaks to media. With respect to outside the company, I've got a list of 6 or so entities that I think are critical to consider. First, customers and clients. Your customers and your clients need to have confidence in the ongoing operations of the company. You need to ensure that their confidential information to the greatest extent possible is protected so that you can have a successful business going forward after the crisis subsides. Similarly, and particularly with respect to publicly traded companies, investors and shareholders. Publicly traded companies, of course, have a fiduciary duty to shareholders, and the company always needs to be mindful about follow-on civil litigation. I love what Brian said. You need to be quick, but also be accurate. That's exactly on point. If you disclose too late, you may face securities fraud litigation. And if you disclose too soon, but with incorrect information, you may also face a securities fraud civil litigation. You should always have internally a disclosure review team, including attorneys in place. Another set of constituents, Katie, would be vendors and third-party business partners. Like clients and customers, they need to have confidence in ongoing operations. Their third-party information should be protected. And particularly in some of what I've seen in my practice, the company in crisis may very well be holding goods of the third party. And the company in crisis may be worried about those goods that, for example, the goods are stolen goods. These are tricky issues that need to be worked out. They need to be worked out quickly and thoughtfully. And the good news is that you can plan in advance for a number of these scenarios. Now, another thing that Brian mentioned, having in place a list of go-to vendors, certainly outside counsel, but others, depending on your industry. If you're in the blockchain industry, you may want to have on board prearranged engagement with a blockchain analysis or tracing company. There are a number out there. It's important to have retained, or at least to have a relationship with key vendors in advance so that we don't waste time on an engagement letter, for example. Another constituent, Katie, are outside auditors. Again, especially if you're at a publicly traded company, these outside auditors often hold the keys about whether you will be able to report on your quarterly or annual 10Ks and Qs timely, and your response and the ability to communicate or lack thereof could really impact the auditor's confidence in management and operations and with respect to internal controls over financial reporting. Of course, we have regulators as an outside constituent. As I mentioned earlier, if this is a cyber event, you may be required to report within a certain time period. There are, of course, depending on industry, potentially significant safety or environmental considerations, as well as the ability, depending on how the regulators evaluate an initial situation, the company's ability to even continue operations. Finally, but certainly not least, is the media. There are reputational risk considerations, reputational considerations, and I think it is important to balance really getting ahead of the story versus not saying too much until one has their arms around the issue. I think, to Brian's point, it is important to have a key leadership team in place to at least be providing a message internally, because if you're not providing that message from the top down internally, you likely will have sales folks who are out in the field who are getting tons of questions about the crisis. So it's important to manage that internally before it gets managed for you.
Absolutely. As we think through real world scenarios and how this plays out in real life, Brian, you mentioned previously that you were in-house at MCI, actually following the revelation of fraud by former WorldCom executives. How did that experience and working through that experience inform how you approach crisis management going forward and the lessons you've learned?
So it's pretty definitional. I mean, that was an organization, albeit a very large publicly traded company, that did not have a lot of forethought and processes in place, which is very similar to a lot of founder-led, founder-run companies. So as I've thought about whether it's developing what we did at MCI for a crisis response, or as I've worked with clients since coming to the firm, I really think this is an area where being proactive can make a difference. This is an area where planning, thought can actually increase and create better outcomes. I think there are three key component parts to that proactive piece with subparts underneath. The first one, and we touched on this earlier, is assessing the landscape. It's really thinking about what are those risks? What are those incidents? What are the indicators of those? So you've thought about that. So you start to see the crisis before it develops or as it's developing on the nascent side. So you're out in front of it as best as you can be. And I think there are a couple of ways to actually go about and do that. There are processes in most companies that start to give you insight into what are the risks. That could be work that's being done by the enterprise risk management function. It can be work that's being done by internal audit where they're seeing maybe control failures or places which could then become bigger problems. It could be your disclosure committee. Obviously, for public companies, you're putting in risk factors into your 10Ks and 10Qs and looking at risks. And it could also be in your compliance program where you're doing your risk assessment in order to create your compliance program. So I think it's taking those internal resources and leveraging those into identifying what are the crises we really need to understand and think about. Secondly, on the landscape is what resources do we have? What are the available resources, both internal and external? We've talked a little bit about who are our internal experts, and then what are the external resources that can be leveraged, whether it's counsel, whether it's forensic accountants, whether it's investigators, whatever it might be, crisis media consultants. Most large corporations will have a set crisis media or crisis communications partner that they regularly work with on that piece and have them under contract. And that can be helpful both from a planning perspective and obviously you don't need the delay of trying to contract with someone as the crisis unfolds. You need to understand in these crises, what's the potential impact, the operational, financial types of things. And then finally, what are your controls in there? So that's kind of the first piece of assessing the landscape. The second piece is actually having a plan. And it might be more than one plan. You may have a breach protocol, which would be a breach scenario, a more general crisis plan, or a crisis plan that's oriented to something that you think is more likely. So you might have more than one plan, but you really should have a plan. And it could be more than one. And the plan can't be too prescriptive because you cannot foresee each and every crisis and how it will unfold, even if it's a known risk. So it has to have some flexibility. You have to get the right, is it just right from a prescriptive versus high level perspective? And then you have to think about what goes into that plan. So how do you do that initial assessment of the levels of crisis? Is it immediate? Is it short-term, long-term actions? How do you close out and recover? So you're going to want to start to put this into phases and think about where does your plan fit in the phases, day one, day two. Plans that I've worked on with this, when actually a crisis happens, might be actually hourly based and then daily and then weekly. You have to understand what are the business needs that have to be addressed in parallel to the crisis to ensure that there's business continuity. What you don't want to do is have a crisis in one part of the business, take down the whole business. So you got to have people go, okay, focus on running the business while we handle the crisis. So you have to start to put in place who's going to do what and how are you going to do that? Because you don't want as a leadership team lose sight of actually the core part of the business that's running well. And you actually have to have a plan to fail. What could go wrong? And then how do you actually figure out how do you recover from that? Because it's not going to be perfect in any scenario that's out there. And when you think about that, what could go wrong? I mean, a good example could be like I was talking about this crisis with a medical necessity determination, and then you actually want to talk about it. So you start to talk about the patient's condition and why you made the decision. And now you've just breached HIPAA. And now you have another problem that's going on. So again, you have to really think about where are the failure points and make sure you don't get to them. So the third piece would be training and testing the program. It's nice to write up the plan. It's really nice to have it putting on a shelf. But if your people that are involved in implementing that plan aren't familiar with it, haven't tested it, there hasn't been a tabletop to try to figure out what to do, people are not going to be able to actually execute on that plan. So you really want to have some sort of training tabletop exercise to make sure people understand what they need to do. This is not natural for business executives. This is a learned response. So you need to have that exercise, that training in order to get that learned response, to get a better response to a crisis.
I think one of the really critical things, and we've talked about this a little bit, is being nimble in the face of a crisis, whether that's having the core team who can respond quickly, training and testing the program so people actually know what to do when the crisis arises. And I think really that first 48 to 72 hours of a crisis can be really core to mitigating the impact that the crisis has on the organization. Dave, in your experience, why are those first hours so important to respond correctly to?
It's a great question, Katie. And sometimes, given the news cycle, it's less than 48 hours. So look, I think that initial period has the potential for the greatest and biggest missteps if the team that Brian described earlier isn't coordinated and isn't organized. Some of the things that could go wrong: you lose your privilege protections, there are leaks to media before the company can get out ahead of the issues. There's the potential for conflicting messages externally, potentially worse, again, from my perspective as a former federal prosecutor, the loss of evidence, even where the company does not intend to lose evidence. So I think, as Brian said, it's critical, especially in those first few hours, first day, first 2 days, to ensure that the company can quickly take control of the situation to start de-escalating and mitigating and remediating even at that early point, regardless of the type of crisis. That includes cyber breaches, dawn raids, insider threats, and related ones. As Brian said, this is exactly why having a core leadership team and a defined leadership team to make decisions, as well as a defined communication plan, is really critical, in addition to an action plan. So as Brian mentioned earlier, this is where having that core established leadership team, ensuring that everyone on the ground knows who's empowered to speak, and probably more importantly, who is not authorized to speak, who is empowered and authorized to make decisions in a crisis, is going to benefit the organization tremendously. It allows for fast action, and it lessens the risk that someone, even with the greatest of intentions and done in good faith, could make a terrible misstep or a mistake when trying to be helpful. Now, the communication plan, of course, is separate from the action plan. And as I just mentioned, communication plan includes who's authorized to speak on behalf of the company, to whom, and on what topics. Now, in my practice, Katie, I've been able to draw on a fair amount of my experience as a former law enforcement person and come up with plans and procedures for dawn raids, for an unanticipated and unexpected visit, to use the term lightly, from law enforcement. And there, we've worked with clients on policies and procedures, action plans, training on the action plans. We even have little laminated wallet-sized cards for individuals in the company who are most likely to have first contact with the authorities. We do these tabletop exercises that Brian referenced. We work through scenarios. And in each case, and particularly in the case of a dawn raid, I think there are some important takeaways. This is not specific legal advice, but these are important guidelines and good takeaways. So one, the company, its employees, should be well trained on how to preserve the attorney-client privilege. There's 2 quick notes there in the face of a law enforcement visit or a dawn raid. Law enforcement, if they've been properly trained, they actually don't want to come across privileged documents. It's a huge litigation risk down the road. The law enforcement agent or even the prosecutor who is on that team could get disqualified off of a case that eventuates, or quote unquote tainted from the case, and evidence that is collected in violation of a Sixth Amendment right, for example, or that violated the attorney-client privilege, could very well be suppressed. At the same time, I think we try to remind folks to assume, to believe that everything is being recorded. And as a father of younger children, I try to remind them as well that everything is being recorded. And that is especially so in the many single consent to record states that our clients operate in. So conversations during a dawn raid that you may have with non-lawyer colleagues within earshot of law enforcement, they're fair game. You should assume that law enforcement is recording these conversations, and it is on each individual employee as well as the company itself to protect confidentiality and the attorney-client privilege. As far as communications go in the event of a dawn raid or law enforcement visit, critical to communicate and coordinate through counsel. It's critical to ensure that no external communications occur except through official channels. And I think, as Brian mentioned, having a draft press release or standby press statements or talking points or even bullet points, critical to have that in place, regardless of the type of crisis. You need to have it at the ready, and it can be informed by the best anticipation of what may happen in a crisis, but also it helps the company revisit its own values and articulate its core values in the face of a crisis. I think what the specific advice that we typically give to individual employees: do your best to stay calm, be professional and courteous, do not act rashly. The concern about acting rashly in the face of a law enforcement raid is that law enforcement could incorrectly draw the conclusion that you are attempting to obstruct the investigation or even threaten their safety. So despite having folks potentially with raid jackets at your facility, do your best to stay calm, be professional, and be courteous.
Clearly, we could all talk about this for a very long time. And there are a lot of really great points that I feel like we just started to dive into. But we're coming to the end of our time today. If you could give one piece of advice to those who are listening, who are in the process of developing or reviewing their crisis management plans, what would it be? Brian?
Yeah, I guess from my perspective, it would be take the time to plan. This is like buying an insurance policy, which, by the way, you should consider insurance as you get through your crisis plan. But literally, this is a time where you can make a difference. So spend the time, spend the resources. It's worth the money. You can't get it back at the end of the day if you don't do it, because you can't do it once the crisis happens. So I would say it's really spending the time and being proactive on this, because it's one of those things that can really make a difference.
I agree. And for me, Katie, I think it's really critical to ensure that the crisis management plan and compliance plans generally are responsive to current business risks, people that the business serves, times that the business is operating in. I think the best example is in 2019, I don't know that anyone was thinking about a global pandemic and how that could impact their operations. Having a plan and practicing that plan is critical. We'd like to have tabletop exercises. They are well worth their weight, and the resources that the company might spend up front to be able to think calmly and clearly and to know what the plan is in the event of a crisis.
Excellent advice all around. And thank you both for your insights today. And thank you to those of you who tuned in for joining us. If you have any questions or if we can assist any of you as you consider your organization's crisis management plan, please do not hesitate to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to DLA Piper's Beyond the Curve podcast. All information, content, and materials contained in this podcast are for general informational purposes only. This podcast is intended to be a general overview of the subjects discussed and does not create a lawyer-client relationship. Statements and opinions are those of the individual speakers and participants and do not necessarily reflect the policies or opinions of DLA Piper, LLP US. The information contained in this podcast is not and should not be used as a substitute for legal advice. No listener should act or refrain from acting with respect to any particular legal matter on the basis of this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel in the relevant jurisdiction. This podcast may qualify as lawyer advertising, requiring notice in some jurisdictions. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. DLA Piper, LLP US accepts no responsibility for any actions taken or not taken as a result of this podcast.